The inner life of ancient Greek temples has always hovered between myth and silence. From a distance, these sanctuaries appeared to be the fixed heart of the city-state columns rising above the earth, marble glowing in sunlight, and rituals shaped by memory older than the walls that contain them. Yet behind those public facades existed a world that only a few were allowed to enter. Women assigned to temple service lived according to rules that shaped every movement, gesture, and breath. Some of these women came from prominent families, chosen for duty by tradition or political arrangement. Others were dedicated to the gods from childhood. Their lives took place in a world of incense, carved stone, and expectations that rarely matched the myths later told about them. Inside these sacred spaces, daily routines were not simply acts of devotion. They were forms of labor, surveillance, and limitation. Each temple held its own customs, its own structure of authority, and its own boundaries that defined what a woman could touch, hear, or speak. What happened to these women was often recorded indirectly hinted through inscriptions, legal fragments, or passing remarks by ancient writers. The temple shaped them, and their silence shaped the temple's legacy. The journey of a girl chosen for temple life often began long before she crossed the sanctuary threshold. In the city of Athens, records from the 5th century BCE show that families sometimes offered daughters as part of civic or religious obligations. A name like Phileia, appearing in a fragmentary inscription near the Acropolis, hints at a young attendant whose duties began in childhood. Similar patterns appear in Delphi, where references to the Thyades, women linked to Dionysian rites, suggest a structured entry into sacred service. These women were not anonymous to their own communities, yet history remembers them only through brief markings on stone. Before arrival at the temple, the girl underwent a ritual cleansing. Some sources mention dates tied to seasonal festivals such as the Anthesteria in late winter, when purification ceremonies aligned with citywide events. Though details vary among regions like Corinth, Thebes, and Argos, the general sequence echoed across the Greek world. The girl was bathed, anointed, and wrapped in garments meant to signal transition. Her family participated publicly, but the next steps belonged to the temple alone. Upon reaching the sanctuary gates, the girl encountered an environment unlike any part of ordinary life. Temples such as the one dedicated to Apollo at Delphi or Athena Polias in Athens were not simply religious buildings. They were administrative centers, treasuries, and political symbols. The presence of women within these structures therefore required strict regulation. Some inscriptions from the 4th century BCE outline penalties for approaching restricted areas, suggesting that movement within temples was closely monitored. A female attendant could enter certain rooms, but many spaces, especially those storing city wealth or containing sacred relics, remained forbidden. The arrival ceremony itself emphasized separation. The priest, whose name rarely survives but whose office held authority, spoke formal words acknowledging the girl's new role. The exact phrasing is lost, yet mentions in the writings of Pausanias and Plutarch imply standardized formulas. Once the ritual concluded, the family stepped back. The temple took responsibility for her well-being, training, and behavior. From that moment, her identity merged with the sanctuary's rhythm. Daily life inside ancient Greek temples did not revolve around constant worship. Instead, it involved practical tasks that kept the sacred environment functioning. Women swept mosaic floors, polished ritual vessels, embroidered textiles for festivals, and tended lamps that symbolized divine presence. In larger centers like Delphi, women also managed offerings left by visitors from distant regions' objects, inscribed with the names of individuals from Ionia, Thessaly, or the islands of the Aegean. These tasks connected them to a wider Greek world, even though their own lives remained enclosed. Despite their visibility during certain ceremonies, temple women experienced strict boundaries. Historical references to the Araphoro young girls serving Athena in Athens describe pathways they followed at night, carrying mysterious objects whose meanings remain unknown. Although their movements were ritualized, they were never unsupervised. A woman's presence within a temple was always regulated, her actions shaped by custom and observation. The sanctuary promised protection, but it also demanded obedience. In some regions, these women gained respect through their association with the divine. A fragment from Epidaurus, dated around 350 BCE, lists temple attendants who received portions of sacrificial meat, an indication of honor in Greek society. Yet such acknowledgement did not grant freedom. Even respected attendants lived within walls whose rules extended deeper than the stone that framed them. Thus, the girl who entered the temple stepped into a life that balanced reverence, labor, and restriction. Her presence enriched the sanctuary, upheld tradition, and fulfilled civic expectation. But every step inside those sacred boundaries revealed a world where devotion intertwined with control, and where a woman's role was shaped by forces older than the myths that later celebrated the temples themselves. Life within the sacred boundaries of a Greek temple unfolded according to rhythms shaped by custom, season, and the expectations of those who controlled the sanctuary. When a young woman crossed the threshold for the first time, she entered not merely a building, but a world enclosed by myth and civic authority. Accounts from regions such as Attica, Boeotia, and Laconia, though fragmentary, offer glimpses into the structured routines that shaped her transformation from a citizen's daughter into a guardian of sacred order. Most temples began their day at dawn. In the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia near Sparta, ancient descriptions hint at early morning rituals when attendants opened inner chambers and prepared offerings. At sites like Eleusis near Athens, records from the 5th century BCE describe women sweeping stone thresholds before the first visitors arrive. Their work ensured that every surface reflected the dignity of the deity. Even simple tasks were woven into the larger meaning of the temple's daily existence. Within the inner rooms, the air carried the faint scent of olive oil used for lamps, mixed with the dryness of limestone and the sweetness of stored incense. Women tended these lamps with care, trimming wicks and replenishing oil, drawn from containers sealed by officials. In the sanctuary of Apollo on Delos, inscriptions mention inventories of temple vessels, including bronze cauldrons and silver bowls. Temple women handled such items only under supervision, for these objects represented the wealth not just of the temple, but of the city itself. As the day progressed, attendants often engaged in textile work. At the temple of Athena Polias in Athens, a group known as the Ergastini prepared the sacred peplos, the woven garment offered during the Panathenaic festival. Though the festival occurred only once every few years, the weaving occupied much of the intervening time. Women selected dyes, spun wool, and wove patterns dictated by tradition. The specifics of these designs are lost, but references in later accounts by Herodotus and Pausanias suggest they depicted mythic battles or acts of divine protection. Temple women did not perform these tasks in isolation. Overseers, priests, magistrates, or older attendants monitored their work and instructed them in the correct methods. At Delphi, an official known as the Neokoros held responsibility for maintaining order within the sanctuary grounds. Although male administrators controlled the most sensitive areas, women carried out much of the physical labor necessary for the temple's functioning. Their contribution was essential, yet rarely celebrated. Midday brought moments of heightened activity. Offerings arrived from residents of nearby towns, travelers from distant islands, or envoys representing foreign cities. In sanctuaries like Olympia, where festivals drew large crowds, attendants worked to organize votive objects, clean altars, and prepare spaces for sacrifice. These periods revealed the dual nature of temple life: quiet routine punctuated by ceremonial intensity. Women often acted as intermediaries between worshippers and officials, translating requests, presenting offerings, or guiding visitors toward designated areas. Despite the movement and noise of public rituals, many sections of the temple remained deeply private. Storerooms containing sacred objects, sometimes inscribed with the names of donors from Rhodes, Naxos, or Megara, were accessible only at specific times. Young attendants rarely entered these rooms, but their duties often brought them close enough to sense the gravity of the objects kept within. The temple's treasures symbolized not only religious devotion, but also political alliances and social prestige. In the late afternoon, When sunlight shifted across marble floors, women completed the final tasks of the day. Lamps were checked once more, textiles stored, and altars cleared of ash. Records from the 4th century BCE indicate that some temples employed rotating groups of attendants, allowing women to rest between cycles of duty. Yet rest did not mean freedom. They lived inside quarters attached to the sanctuary, remaining within reach of the endless work that sustained the divine household. As night approached, attendants performed closing rituals, guided by instructions passed down through generations. At the Temple of Demeter, in Eleusis, ancient commentators note that sacred doors were sealed with cords, or clay tokens marked by magistrates. Women bore witness to these acts, their presence reinforcing the sanctity of the space. Then the temple grew quiet, its boundaries guarded by custom, expectation, and the vigilance of those within. For the women who lived inside these walls, each day followed patterns shaped centuries before their birth. Though their names seldom appear in surviving records, their labor preserved the sanctuaries that cities prized above all else. They existed within a structure where service, silence, and unending responsibility defined the contours of their lives. The life of a woman inside an ancient Greek temple was shaped by layers of rules that defined where she stood, how she moved, and what she was permitted to touch. These rules were not written in a single document, but existed as a woven structure of custom, expectation, and unspoken boundaries. A woman entering temple service learned them not through formal instruction but through observation, correction, and the steady pressure of tradition. Each day began with silence, not a sacred vow, but a practical requirement. Speaking too early or too loudly within the temple could disturb ongoing rites, disrupt preparations, or break the sense of order expected in every sacred environment. Silence also functioned as a reminder that the women did not stand at the center of temple authority. Their presence served the sanctuary. It did not shape it. Movement came next. A woman could not simply walk where she wished. Certain rooms were accessible only at designated times, and some areas remained permanently closed to all but a few officials. Even in smaller sanctuaries, paths were defined by invisible lines that everyone within the walls understood. A corridor might be used only for carrying offerings. A doorway might stay open only during specific ceremonies. The rules filtered who could stand near altars, storerooms, or ritual vessels. Every step signaled awareness of these boundaries. Dress also held meaning. Garments were simple yet uniform, chosen not for decoration but for clarity. Cleanliness mattered. The fabric had to remain free from dye or adornment that implied status. A woman's clothing reminded the community and herself of her role as part of the temple's machinery. No area within the sanctuary allowed casual appearance. Even the way fabric folded across the shoulder carried expectations. Tasks followed a structured order. A woman might begin with sweeping, continue with tending lamps, then assist with textiles or preparations for the next ritual. Each task had rules that ensured continuity. The cleaning of an altar required specific motions. The trimming of a lamp wick followed a pattern. Even the placing of a vessel had a correct angle and a correct distance from the next object. Food and rest were regulated with equal care. Meals were modest and taken away from the main chambers. Rest hours were granted, but only when the day's duties had been completed. A woman did not wander the temple grounds freely. Designated spaces existed for eating, sitting, or sleeping. These spaces were plain, furnished only with what necessity required. Personal items were few, for the temple was not her home but her responsibility. Punishments existed for breaking rules, though their exact forms varied. Correction could be soft, a warning, a reminder, a guiding gesture from an older attendant. But repeated mistakes or moments of perceived disrespect carried more serious consequences. Removal from a task, confinement to quarters, or loss of privileges might follow. The rules aimed not to harm, but to maintain order. The sanctuary depended on routine, and routine depended on obedience. Evenings returned the sanctuary to stillness. Women completed the closing tasks and withdrew to their quarters. The lamps burned low. The stone walls cooled. The rules remained, settling into the quiet like a second skin. When sleep came, It did not erase the boundaries of the day. It only paused them. Living within these rules shaped the women as much as their duties did. The structure of the temple pressed itself into their habits, their gestures, their way of seeing the world. The rules governed their days, and in time, their days made the rules feel natural, inevitable, and complete. Beyond the visible routines performed near entrances, altars, and courtyards, temple women carried out tasks that visitors never witnessed. These duties formed the quiet framework of sanctuary life, shaping the temple's daily existence long before crowds arrived, and long after they dispersed. Hidden work sustained the sacred atmosphere that the public assumed was effortless. The first of these unseen duties involved preparation. Before any ritual could begin, the spaces in which it unfolded had to be arranged with precise care. Women cleaned surfaces that no visitor touched, polishing stone that supported ritual vessels, and sweeping corners that gathered dust but never received attention. They inspected lamps, counting how many would be lit that day, and replacing wicks at varying lengths depending on the ceremony. Such preparations required no audience and received no acknowledgement, yet the rituals depended on them completely. Storage chambers also demanded silent labor. Offerings accumulated their woven garlands, jars of oil, bowls used only during specific festivals. Women cataloged these items, not in written records, but through memory and arrangement. Each object had a place, and that place reflected its purpose. The organization of these chambers followed an order learned through repetition, passed from one attendant to the next. In these private rooms, the air remained cool and still, carrying the scent of old wood and dried herbs. Another hidden duty centered on ritual textiles. Some cloths hung before sacred images, others draped altars, and some were folded for future ceremonies. Women examined each piece, repairing frayed edges or replacing threads weakened by time. They worked in quiet spaces where the only sound came from the pull of thread through fabric. Their stitching reinforced the dignity of rituals that the public later saw, without understanding the hours that sustained them. Water played a constant role in temple life, requiring its own careful handling. Women drew it from specific sources and filtered it through linen cloths before use. They washed vessels used for purification rites and dried them in the shade so sunlight would not crack the clay. These small acts shaped every ritual involving cleansing, though no visitor watched the preparation. Some duties addressed the maintenance of sacred symbols placed within the temple. Objects representing purity, protection, or divine presence needed repositioning according to the season or ritual calendar. Women adjusted them without commentary, guided by customs that defined angles, distances, and arrangements. Their touch preserved continuity from one generation to the next. Life within the temple unfolded along invisible lines that shaped every movement. These boundaries were not marked by walls or written rules, yet they held the same firmness as stone. A woman serving in the sanctuary learned them early, often through quiet correction or the steady guidance of those who had served before her. Over time, these boundaries became part of her sense of place, defining where she stood in the vast structure of sacred order. The first boundary concerned space. Not every room within the temple was accessible to those who lived there. Some chambers held objects considered too sacred for daily handling. Others stored items meant only for rites that occurred once each year. Certain thresholds could be crossed only during specific phases of ritual preparation. Even then, the women entered not as individuals, but as extensions of the ceremony itself. They stepped where tradition allowed, turned when instructed, and withdrew the moment their task was complete. Another boundary separated sound from silence. Certain areas required quiet, not out of reverence alone, but because silence maintained the conditions rituals depended on. A woman knew when her footsteps must soften, when her breath needed to slow, and when speech became an intrusion. The temple's interior responded to sound differently than the world outside. A single echo could disturb the fragile stillness that rituals cultivated, and so silence became a discipline learned through repetition. Time also imposed its own boundary. Duties shifted according to the hour, and the boundary of each moment mattered. Lamps were lit at precise times. Cloths were folded at particular points in the day. Floors were swept before dawn, never after. Rituals that required cleansing always occurred before a certain threshold of sunlight entered the temple. A woman who crossed these temporal boundaries disrupted the order of the sanctuary, even if her intentions were good. The temple functioned on rhythms older than any attendant, and she adjusted herself to them, not the other way around. There were boundaries shaped by touch as well. Not every object could be handled freely. Some items required preparation before a woman could grasp them. Others she could never touch at all. The surfaces of altars, the handles of vessels, the edges of sacred cloths, each held a meaning that dictated whether her hand could rest upon them. Touch was permission, and permission depended on role, task, and necessity. Even repeated duties required caution, for no object within the sanctuary was ever simply an object. Another boundary concerned presence. A woman knew when she must step aside, move behind a pillar, or leave a chamber altogether. Certain rituals required her participation, but others demanded her absence. She learned to read these cues not from signs or commands, but from the subtle gestures of those who directed temple life. A nod could grant entry, a raised hand could end it. Reverence was measured not only in what she did, but in how she withdrew. There were boundaries shaped by emotion as well. The temple did not welcome displays of sorrow, anger, or excitement. A calm expression reflected discipline, while a quiet posture signaled readiness. Attendants absorbed these expectations until they became habitual, creating an inner stillness that matched the outer one. Emotion had no place in the sanctuary's ritual structure, and a woman learned to leave it at the threshold. These boundaries did not confine the women through force. Instead, they shaped their behavior until constraint felt natural. Each limit existed to preserve an order that the sanctuary embodied. Stepping outside those limits meant stepping out of alignment with the sacred rhythm the temple upheld. And so, day after day, the women lived within lines that guided their steps, shaped their thoughts, and defined the contours of their existence. Stillness inside the temple was more than an absence of movement. It was a discipline, a quiet state that shaped the women from the inside outward. When they first entered sanctuary life, their steps carried the energy of the world beyond the walls, the rhythm of the streets, the voices of families, the distractions of ordinary living. All of that gradually softened. The temple taught stillness through repetition, expectation, and the steady presence of tasks that required calm attention. Over time, the women learned to hold that stillness not just in their hands or movements, but deep within their breathing, their posture, and even their thoughts. The stillness began each morning, when the sanctuary remained dim and cool. Before any lamp was lit, the women worked in a hush that felt almost like the air itself was listening. Their bodies adjusted to this environment, becoming careful in how they lifted vessels or arranged cloth. Even the sound of a foot brushing against stone seemed too loud in these early hours. They learned to steady themselves, to move with intention, and to let their gestures become an extension of the quiet around them. Stillness, in these moments, felt like a shared agreement between themselves and the temple. Throughout the day, this cultivated calm shaped their interactions with objects that required delicate handling. Filling lamps needed precision. Folding cloths demanded concentration. Sorting offerings required their minds to rest in a place where no urgency disturbed them. When they carried vessels through corridors, they kept their bodies centered, allowing nothing to jostle or break the balance of their steps. The stillness they practiced prevented accidents, but it also communicated respect for the sacredness embedded in their tasks. The temple responded to calm hands, and the women learned to give it nothing else. Stillness shaped their breathing as well. The air inside the temple carried subtle scents: oil, dust, stone, dried herbs, and the women inhaled these slowly, as if matching their breath to the quiet pulse of the sanctuary. They avoided sudden exhalations or sharp sighs that might disturb the silence. Breathing became a controlled act, measured and softened, guiding their bodies through long hours of work. This practiced breath steadied them during rituals, during preparation, and during the moments when visitors filled the outer courtyards with noise. The sanctuary had its own rhythm, and by aligning their breath to it, The women became part of its living structure. Stillness also governed their responses to the demands placed upon them. Instructions were often given with minimal words, sometimes only with gestures. A nod directed them to a task. A hand raised toward a doorway signaled where they were needed next. They listened with their eyes, their posture, and their awareness of the space. Instead of asking questions or seeking clarification, they observed and adapted. This responsiveness required a quiet mind, one that could interpret subtle signals without agitation or impatience. The stillness became a form of communication, allowing them to understand without speaking and to act without disrupting the sanctuary's calm. In quieter corners of the temple, where storerooms or shaded alcoves softened the light, the women practiced tasks that relied entirely on stillness. Sorting scrolls, sifting powdered incense, or wrapping fragile offerings required a level of focus that shut out the world beyond their fingertips. These tasks trained their attention so thoroughly that they could work for long stretches without losing steadiness. Stillness became the foundation upon which accuracy rested, and accuracy was central to every object that passed through their hands. Even emotional stillness became part of their discipline. The temple did not welcome the turbulence of personal thoughts or feelings. A woman learned to set aside irritation, sadness, excitement, or worry, leaving them unexpressed within the sanctuary. This emotional quiet served the rituals that demanded composure. It also protected the inner workings of the temple from disruptions that could ripple through the ordered structure of the day. By stilling their minds, the women created a living reflection of the sanctuary's architecture, balanced, measured, composed. At night, when duties ended and lamps dimmed, the stillness did not leave them. It settled into their bodies like a second breath. Even in their quarters, where conversation was permitted in soft tones, the quiet they carried shaped how they prepared for rest. Their steps remained measured, their gestures controlled. Stillness had become a habit, one that followed them long after they stepped away from the central chambers. In time, the women no longer distinguished between the stillness of the temple and the stillness within themselves. They walked with it. They worked with it. They became vessels of the calm that defined the sanctuary. The temple taught them stillness, and they, in turn, kept that stillness alive. Life inside the temple unfolded under continuous observation. Even when no priest stood nearby, even when the sanctuary felt quiet and still, the women who served there lived with the sense that every action carried consequence. Watching did not always involve direct supervision. Sometimes it came from the older attendants who had memorized the rhythms of temple life and could detect the smallest disruption. Sometimes it came from the structure itself, from the awareness that the temple's order depended on each person remaining within the boundaries that tradition demanded. The women grew accustomed to this presence, though it shaped their behavior in ways they rarely questioned. Observation began the moment a woman entered the day's tasks. As she tended a lamp or swept a pathway, there was an expectation that she performed each movement with precision. An uneven gesture signaled inattention. A sound out of place implied carelessness. The watching did not punish immediately, but it lingered, allowing mistakes to settle into memory. Women learned to anticipate correction before it arrived. They adjusted their movements not because someone told them to, but because they sensed the gaze of authority woven into the temple walls. The eyes that watched them were not always those of people. The sanctuary held its own form of scrutiny, expressed in the arrangement of space. Narrow corridors demanded disciplined posture. High thresholds required deliberate steps. Large empty rooms magnified every sound, making even a soft breath feel exposed. Women became aware of how their bodies occupied these spaces, how their footsteps echoed, and how their shadows stretched across stone. The temple observed through the environment it created, reminding them that carelessness disturbed not only routine, but the sanctity they upheld. This constant awareness shaped their interactions with one another. Conversations happened in whispers, if they happened at all. Each woman understood that her words might be overheard, interpreted, or carried beyond their intended purpose. Friendship existed, but it grew carefully, wrapped in the knowledge that closeness could invite speculation. Support emerged quietly, through small acts handing another a tool, smoothing a wrinkle in a garment, sharing the strain of a task without drawing attention. The watching presence shaped not only behavior but relationships, teaching them to balance connection with caution. Even moments of rest were not free from observation. A woman sitting alone in a corner of the temple knew that her posture, expression, and stillness could be noted. Fatigue had to look controlled. Contemplation had to look purposeful. Any sign of frustration, grief, or longing risked being interpreted as dissatisfaction with her position. And dissatisfaction, if left unaddressed, could be seen as a threat to the delicate harmony of temple life. So the women learned to erase evidence of internal struggles, carrying their private emotions behind masks of composure. The watching also shaped how they approached sacred tasks. Before lifting a vessel or adjusting a cloth, a woman paused not out of hesitation, but out of awareness that intention mattered. The sanctuary's scrutiny extended beyond physical actions into the realm of thought. A task performed with impatience or indifference felt out of alignment with the expectations placed upon them. They worked slowly, steadily, as though their thoughts were being measured alongside their movements. There were times when the watching felt heavier than others. During ceremonies, for example, crowds gathered outside the temple, their expectations forming a pressure that seeped through the walls. A woman carrying an object for ritual knew that dozens of eyes might fall upon her the moment she stepped into view. The community expected grace, precision, and unwavering discipline. Any misstep, however small, reflected not only on her, but on the entire sanctuary. Awareness of this scrutiny sharpened her senses, tightening her posture, and steadying her breath. Even at night, when the doors closed and the sanctuary settled into stillness, the women felt the presence of watching. Darkness softened the edges of the chamber, but it did not erase responsibility. Lamps flickered faintly, casting long shadows that seemed to move with intention. The quiet held expectation rather than rest, reminding the women that order must be protected at every hour. A soft sound in the corridor might prompt them to rise, to check, to adjust whatever felt out of place. Night did not dissolve vigilance. It merely changed its form. Over time, the watching became internal. Women learned to observe themselves, correcting flaws before others noticed them. They monitored their own posture, measured their own words, and shaped their behavior to meet expectations. What began as external discipline transformed into an inner guide. The temple no longer needed to watch them. They watched themselves in its place. This transformation left a lasting imprint. Even after their time in the sanctuary ended, some women carried the weight of watching into the rest of their lives. They walked with measured steps, spoke with tempered voices, and approached tasks with quiet precision. The temple had shaped them through its constant gaze, teaching them to live with awareness of every movement. In doing so, it ensured that its influence endured long after they stepped beyond its walls. Rituals shaped the rhythm of temple life, guiding the actions of the women who served within its walls. These rituals did not always arrive with grandeur or public display. Many unfolded quietly, woven into the fabric of each day. The women learned them through repetition, through observation, and through the steady expectation that every gesture held meaning. Over time, the rituals became so familiar that they performed them without question, even if the reasons behind them had softened into fragments of memory rather than clear instruction. The first ritual of the day often involved light. Before dawn settled into full brightness, a woman walked to the designated lamps within the sanctuary. She carried oil with steady hands, pouring it carefully so the flame would rise without sputtering. Lighting the lamps was not merely a practical task. It marked the beginning of the temple's awakening. The moment the first wick glowed, the sanctuary shifted from stillness to activity. The woman performing the task sensed this transition, though she rarely considered why the timing mattered. It simply did. Another ritual centered on cleansing. Surfaces within the temple gathered dust, though slowly, as though the air itself respected the sacredness of the place. Women wiped stone altars with cloths kept solely for that purpose. They washed vessels used in purification rites, letting water run in thin streams that echoed softly in the quiet chambers. Even the smallest bowl received attention. The women followed the ritual patterns without deviation, aware that consistency preserved the sanctity of the space more effectively than explanation ever could. Ritual folding of cloths formed another quiet practice. Each piece of fabric held a position within the temple, whether draped over a statue, covering an altar, or awaiting use during a ceremony. Women learned the folds, the angles, and the exact order in which cloths were stacked. These instructions passed from one attendant to another, carrying centuries of tradition within their simple movements. Folding became meditative, a moment when the body worked with ease and the mind settled into gentle stillness. There were also rituals tied to offering preparation. Women arranged objects on low tables, aligning them according to patterns that felt natural through repetition. Oil containers matched with lamps, water vessels paired with purification bowls, incense portions placed in small ceramic holders. The arrangement changed with the season, yet the underlying order remained the same. A woman performing these tasks did not ask why one bowl belonged beside another. She trusted the structure passed down to her. Sound played a role in daily ritual as well. Some ceremonies required soft tones produced by clappers or bells. Women tested these instruments briefly, ensuring they created the right resonance. The sound that escaped into the chamber was barely audible, but it carried weight. It signaled readiness, marking the boundary between preparation and fulfillment. No one questioned the need for this sound, nor did they question why some rituals required silence instead. Food offerings also followed a ritual pattern. Women placed small portions in designated areas, often without witnessing what happened to them afterward. These offerings were not meals in a conventional sense. They symbolized cycles of giving and receiving that shaped the sanctuary's identity. A woman who carried these offerings did so with the same precision she applied to every ritual, aware that even slight variation could disrupt the order of the day. Evening brought closing rituals. Women extinguished lamps with controlled gestures, letting smoke curl upward in delicate threads. They secured fabrics over sacred objects and checked that tools were stored in correct positions. Each step reversed the morning's rituals, restoring the sanctuary to its state of rest. Night demanded a specific order, just as the day did, and the women followed it with practiced ease. These rituals endured not because the women understood their origins fully, but because the temple depended on continuity. The women who served within its walls became the living keepers of that continuity. Their unquestioning performance of rituals ensured that the sanctuary remained a stable presence in a world that shifted with the seasons and changed with the generations. The rituals were not merely tasks. They were the heartbeat of the temple, expressed through the steady hands and quiet movements of those who upheld them without hesitation. The temple provided a place for its attendants to sleep, but these quarters offered little comfort beyond necessity. The rooms stood apart from the main chambers, set at the edges of the sanctuary, where daily sounds softened into a muted hum. For the women who lived within these walls, the quarters became a space suspended between duty and rest, shaped by rules as firm as those that governed their daily tasks. The quarters held no decoration. Stone walls remained bare, their surfaces cool even during warm seasons. Beds consisted of simple frames or mats laid directly on the floor, covered with woven blankets that offered modest warmth. Each woman had her place, marked not by personal belongings, but by the rhythm of her presence. Items allowed within the quarters were few: a garment or two, a small cloth for washing, perhaps a wooden comb. The simplicity was intentional. Personal attachments could distract from temple service, and the quarters reinforced this expectation. Nights began quietly. After completing the final tasks of the day, the women walked to their quarters in a small procession shaped more by habit than directive. They spoke little as they settled into their spaces. Sleep did not arrive quickly for everyone. The sanctuary's atmosphere lingered even after the lamps were extinguished, filling the quarters with a stillness that pressed against the senses. Some women lay awake, listening to faint sounds drifting from distant chambers, while others fell quickly into the exhaustion of constant routine. Rest itself followed unspoken rules. A woman rose at the same time each morning, regardless of how well she slept. She adjusted her garment before stepping into the corridor, ensuring that no sign of fatigue lingered in her appearance. Even in sleep, she lived within the expectations of the sanctuary. Dreams were private, but waking belonged entirely to duty. Shared space shaped relationships in subtle ways. The women learned each other's habits through the rhythm of nightly preparations. One might fold her garment with meticulous precision. Another might sit silently for a moment before lying down. These small behaviors created familiarity without closeness. The quarters encouraged community, but not intimacy. Any deeper bond risked introducing divided attention, a danger the temple avoided by shaping the women's interactions around function rather than emotion. Temperature shifted with the seasons, but the quarters changed very little. In colder months, the stone amplified the chill, and women wrapped themselves more tightly in their blankets. In warmer periods, they opened small windows near the ceiling to let air circulate, though even this decision followed guidelines learned over generations. The quarters offered shelter, but not refuge. They remained an extension of temple order. The knights brought their own form of vigilance. Though the women rested, a sense of watchfulness lingered. Any sound, a creak in the hallway, the flutter of fabric stirred by a draft reminded them that the temple existed beyond the walls of their sleeping space. The boundary between rest and responsibility blurred. A woman could be summoned before dawn for a ceremony, or asked to assist with an unexpected task. The quarters never allowed her to forget this possibility. Yet despite the strictness, the quarters provided the only moments in which the women could withdraw from public expectation. In the darkness, with no ritual demanding their attention, they felt the weight of the day shift slightly. Thoughts they suppressed during the hours of work surfaced quietly. Memories of life before the temple might drift into their minds, softened by time. The quarters allowed these reflections, though only in silence. When dawn approached, the faintest change in the air signaled the return of duty. Women rose without delay, each performing her small preparations before stepping into the corridor. The quarters emptied just as they had filled, in orderly sequence, leaving behind no trace of the moments spent within them. The space where they slept shaped them as much as their work did. It taught restraint, reinforced simplicity, and reminded them that rest existed not for comfort, but to sustain their service. Within those austere walls, the women learned to live with quiet endurance, carrying the discipline of the sanctuary into every waking moment. Food within the temple was never abundant, never indulgent, and never meant to satisfy desire. It existed as part of a controlled rhythm, a necessary provision rather than a source of comfort. The women ate not to enjoy their meals, but to maintain the strength required for their tasks. Their hunger quiet, persistent, and disciplined became another part of temple life, shaping their days as firmly as any rule or ritual. Meals followed predictable patterns. The women ate twice each day, once in the early hours, and once as evening approached. These meals occurred in a designated space set apart from the main sanctuary, a plain room furnished with low tables or simple mats. Silence often accompanied eating, not out of strict requirement, but because the atmosphere of the temple left little room for casual talk. The women consumed their food with the same measured attention they applied to their duties. The meals themselves were modest. Bread formed the foundation, dense, coarse, and often slightly hardened by storage. Olives appeared frequently, their sharp flavor cutting through the dryness of the bread. Occasionally there was fruit, chosen not for ripeness but for availability. A small portion of lentils or barley stew might accompany the meal, though it rarely carried enough warmth or seasoning to offer comfort. Water was the primary drink, taken sparingly, for the temple taught restraint even in thirst. These meals sustained the body, but hunger rarely disappeared. The women learned to live with it, accepting its presence as part of their service. Hunger sharpened discipline. It kept the mind attentive, the body light, and the senses focused. Even when the stomach tightened with emptiness, the women continued their work without comment. Complaints would have felt out of place in a world shaped by endurance. Food offerings played a separate role in temple life. Visitors brought items meant for ritual use: grains, fruit, small cakes shaped for ceremonies. These offerings filled storerooms, but did not belong to the attendants. The women handled them with precision, sorting, and arranging them according to strict guidelines. Their role was to preserve, prepare, or present these items, not to partake in them. The distinction between what they touched and what they consumed highlighted the distance between service and privilege. On rare occasions, the women received portions from sacrificial rituals. These portions were small, carefully measured, and distributed only after the ceremony had concluded. While such moments broke the monotony of their meals, they did not shift the larger reality. Even on those days, hunger lingered. The portions reminded the women that their position within the temple carried responsibility, but not abundance. Seasons influenced the food available, but did not change the pattern of simplicity. In warmer months, figs or grapes might appear in limited quantities. In colder seasons, meals grew plainer still, relying more heavily on stored grains and preserved items. The predictability created stability, yet it also underscored a truth the women understood well. The temple controlled every aspect of their sustenance. Hunger shaped the body as much as the mind. Movements remained light, breathing steady, and posture balanced. A woman learned how to work with careful efficiency, conserving energy without appearing slow. Hunger became part of her discipline, reminding her of the boundaries she lived within. When she walked through the temple, her steps carried the awareness of both strength and limitation. Despite the scarcity, meals served a purpose beyond nourishment. They created a moment of pause, a slight interruption in the relentless sequence of tasks. The women sat together, sharing quiet presence even when they exchanged no words. The act of eating simple, uniform, and brief marked time within a world where hours otherwise blended into one another. Hunger may have accompanied them, but so did the faint comfort of routine. When the women returned to their duties after eating, the world of the sanctuary felt unchanged. The stillness remained, the rituals awaited, and the expectations held firm. The food they consumed kept them moving, but the hunger they carried reminded them of their place within the temple structure. It was a constant presence, quiet, enduring, and woven into the life they had accepted when they stepped through the sanctuary gates. The work of temple women unfolded through quiet repetition, shaped by routines that left little room for personal choice. Each woman entered a system where her tasks did not reflect her preferences but the temple's needs. The duties they performed filled their days with movement, stillness, and careful attention, creating a rhythm that defined their lives more than any spoken rule. Their hands became instruments of service, trained through practice rather than instruction. Many began their mornings by tending to the inner spaces. These areas required steady care, not for comfort but for maintaining the order expected within the sanctuary. Floors were swept with gentle strokes that avoided stirring dust. Lamps were checked to ensure that their oil would last through the next cycle of rituals. Cloth coverings were adjusted so they hung evenly, free of creases or signs of wear. The women worked with measured steps, careful not to disturb the silence that seemed to linger in every corner. Some tasks involved caring for ritual objects. These items, often simple in appearance, held meaning within temple practices. The women cleaned them with small cloths, lifting each object with deliberate movements. They handled bowls, trays, and vessels made of materials like clay or bronze, polishing them until they reflected light in soft, muted tones. The work required patience, for the objects were not to be rushed or treated casually. Even the smallest vessel demanded full attention. Preparation for offerings formed another part of their routine. The women sorted grains, arranged fruits, and measured oils with consistent accuracy. Each offering required presentation in a specific order, creating a visual pattern that aligned with temple tradition. They learned these patterns through observation, repeating them until their hands recognized the steps without conscious thought. The work rarely changed, but it required steady focus. Mistakes were uncommon, not because the tasks were simple, but because repetition had shaped the women into quiet experts. Some women tended the outer spaces where visitors approached the temple. They kept paths clear and removed debris blown in by the wind. Their presence remained discreet, for they were not meant to draw attention. When visitors arrived with offerings, the women accepted the items with controlled gestures and placed them in designated areas. Their interactions remained brief and structured, preserving the boundary between temple attendants and those who came from outside. Other tasks involved maintaining garments worn during rituals. The women mended threads, cleaned stains, and folded cloth in precise shapes. These garments needed to remain in order, ready for use at any moment. The women learned how to recognize small signs of wear and repair them before they grew noticeable. Even this quiet work carried weight, for the garments represented continuity within the temple's daily cycle. Carrying water formed one of the more physically demanding tasks. The women filled vessels from wells or cisterns and transported them across the temple grounds. The weight tested their balance, requiring a steady pace and controlled breath. They walked along familiar routes, placing the vessels where they were needed for cleansing rituals or daily washing. Though demanding, this labor became part of the rhythm they carried without complaint. During certain times of day, some women assisted in preparing spaces for ritual gatherings. They arranged seats, adjusted fabric coverings, and positioned small objects used in ceremonial steps. Their movements shaped the environment long before participants entered. When the gathering ended, the women restored the space to its original state, removing any trace of activity and returning the room to its quiet form. Despite the structure, the tasks held no clear hierarchy. One job did not elevate a woman above another. Instead, the work formed a web of responsibilities that supported the temple's daily functioning. The women moved through this web with practiced ease, never questioning why the system required so many hands. They understood that the purpose of their tasks was not personal fulfillment, but the continuation of the space they served. By evening, their hands showed evidence of the day dust from floors, faint marks from cloth fibers, and the cool scent of oil from polished vessels. Yet their work left little visible impact on the temple itself. The space remained serene, unchanged despite hours of labor. The women returned to their quarters knowing that the next day would mirror the one before it. Their tasks held repetition, but within that repetition lay the silent foundation of temple life. The lives of temple women were shaped not only by tasks, but by rules that settled over them like an unseen structure. These rules did not need to be spoken often, for they were learned through observation, correction, and the steady rhythm of daily life. Their presence guided every movement, gesture, and moment of silence within the temple walls. Through these rules, the women understood the boundaries of their world. The first rule concerned movement. Women walked at a steady pace, never rushing, never lingering. Their steps aligned with the quiet expected within sacred spaces. They avoided blocking doorways, speaking in corridors, or pausing in areas where rituals might unfold. The temple required motion that blended into the background, so the women adopted a style of walking that seemed almost weightless. Even when carrying heavy vessels or armfuls of cloth, they learned to maintain a calm, uninterrupted pace. Another rule dictated speech. Words were used sparingly, held back unless necessary for coordination. Voices kept at low levels preserved the impression of serenity, even when many tasks took place at once. The women communicated through glances, small gestures, or practiced signs. When words were needed, they were brief and factual. Questions were rare, for inquiries could imply uncertainty, and uncertainty was quietly discouraged. Confidence came from repetition, not conversation. Touch carried its own rules. Hands moved carefully when handling objects associated with ritual. The women understood that each surface, whether polished or rough, required a specific way of being held or cleaned. They avoided sudden contact or careless placement. Even when touching everyday items like vessels or cloth, their fingers carried a sense of respect, shaped by the environment. Personal touch, such as contact with another woman, occurred only when task demands required it. The rest of the time, space between bodies remained part of the unspoken order. Time was divided by routines rather than clocks. Each woman learned the sequence of events that structured the day-morning preparation: midday cycles, afternoon tasks, and evening assessments. They knew when lamps needed refilling, when cloth needed changing, when floors needed clearing. These rhythms became internalized until the day unfolded almost automatically. The women rarely asked what came next. Their surroundings answered for them. In this way, The rules made each day predictable, even when the work varied. There were also rules regarding attention. Eyes were trained not to drift toward areas where rituals took place unless duty required presence. The women kept their focus on their work, letting other events remain peripheral. This rule reinforced the boundary between those who performed rituals and those who supported them. Even when movement, sound, or chanting filled the air, the women continued with their tasks, allowing the sacred acts to pass like a distant echo. Silence held a rule of its own. It was not the strict silence of punishment, but a soft, maintained quiet that shaped the atmosphere. Women learned how to close doors without noise, how to place objects without creating sharp sounds, and how to work together with minimal disturbance. The silence made the temple feel larger, as though the absence of noise expanded every hall. In this space, even small sounds carried weight, encouraging the women to remain aware of their presence. Rules also shaped rest. When tasks paused, the women returned to designated areas rather than lingering where rituals were kept. Their rest periods were brief, structured, and aligned with the needs of the day. They sat in stillness, conserving energy for the next cycle of duties. Rest did not involve conversation or leisure. It simply allowed bodies to regain balance before returning to the rhythm that defined their service. Another rule regulated access. Certain rooms remained off limits unless a woman's duties required entry. Doors to inner spaces remained partially closed, signaling boundaries without the need for explanation. The women understood that these rooms held functions beyond their roles, so they passed by without slowing. Access depended on duty, not curiosity. This rule reinforced the separation between different groups within the temple, creating layers of responsibility that never overlapped. There was also a rule about error. Mistakes were corrected quietly but firmly. If a cloth hung unevenly, or an offering arrangement slipped out of order, a senior attendant adjusted it without comment. The correction itself served as instruction. Women learned through watching rather than through reprimand. Over time, the absence of spoken criticism became a form of pressure. Tasks had to be done correctly, not to avoid punishment, but to preserve the smooth functioning of the place. Finally, the women followed a rule about presence. They were expected to appear composed, steady, and attentive during every task. Fatigue, emotion, or distraction could not interfere with the impression of order. Even at moments when the work felt heavy or repetitive, they carried themselves with the same calm manner. Their presence supported the temple's atmosphere as much as any ritual or object. These rules did not emerge from a single source. They developed through tradition and repetition, woven into the fabric of daily life. For the women who lived under them, the rules created a world where structure replaced uncertainty, and duty shaped identity more than personal inclination. Through these quiet boundaries, the temple maintained its order, and the women learned to move within that order with practiced grace. The tasks performed by the women inside the temple carried expectations that shaped how each duty unfolded. These expectations were not written or spoken with ceremony, yet they guided the work as firmly as any formal instruction. Over time, each woman absorbed them until they felt like natural extensions of movement and habit. Through these expectations, the temple maintained its steadiness, allowing every task to blend into the larger rhythm that governed the space. One expectation concerned preparation. Before beginning any duty, the women ensured that hands were clean, garments adjusted, and tools arranged. This preparation created a sense of order that followed them into each task. Even routine actions, like arranging offerings or sweeping walkways, began with small gestures of readiness. These gestures built consistency across the day, helping every woman step into her responsibilities with quiet focus. Another expectation involved patience. Tasks unfolded at measured speeds, without urgency. The women learned not to rush, even when the workload seemed heavy. Instead, they worked in steady sequences, allowing each action to complete itself before moving to the next. This pace allowed the environment to remain calm, giving the impression that the temple existed outside the flow of ordinary time. Patience became not only a method of working, but a way of thinking. There was also an expectation about precision. Each object in the temple held a place, and each task required an exact arrangement. Whether setting lamps, laying cloths, or carrying vessels, the women learned the correct spacing, alignment, and handling for each item. Precision minimized disruption and preserved the sense of harmony within the rooms. Through careful placement and repetition, even small tasks contributed to a larger sense of order. Attention formed another expectation. Women were required to notice details without hesitation. If a lamp's oil ran low, if dust settled in a corner, or if a cloth shifted slightly from its intended angle, they corrected it as naturally as breathing. Attention ensured that no task remained incomplete, and no disruption lingered. Over time, the women developed an awareness that felt continuous, extending to every corner of the temple they entered. Endurance shaped many of the day's activities. The women stood for long periods, carried heavy vessels, and repeated movements until the body grew tired. Yet endurance was expected without complaint or visible strain. The steady posture they maintained created an impression of calm strength. Even when fatigue settled into their limbs, they continued at the same measured pace, allowing the temple's rhythm to guide them through each hour. Another expectation involved cooperation. Tasks rarely belonged to one woman alone. Instead, work passed from hand to hand, with each woman completing one part before the next continued. This cooperation required awareness of timing, spacing, and movement. The women learned to position themselves so that paths remained clear and actions flowed without interruption. Cooperation helped transform individual tasks into a collective effort, making the work feel unified. Discretion formed a quiet expectation that shaped interactions. Questions were limited, commentary avoided, and personal matters set aside. The women understood that the focus remained on the temple, not on themselves. Their personal thoughts stayed inward, and their exchanges centered on the practical elements of the day. Discretion preserved the atmosphere of serenity, allowing the temple to feel insulated from the concerns of the outside world. Adaptability was another expectation. The tasks changed with seasons, rituals, or adjustments in schedule. Women learned how to shift from one duty to another without hesitation. A change in lighting, a sudden need to prepare a room, or an unexpected adjustment in offerings required immediate response. Adaptability helped maintain continuity, ensuring that the temple functioned without visible disruption. There was also an expectation regarding presence. Women were required to appear composed and attentive at all times. Even when the tasks grew repetitive or when the day felt long, they carried themselves with the same graceful posture. Their expressions remained neutral, creating an impression of calm that matched the stillness of the temple's inner rooms. Presence acted as a form of communication, reflecting the steadiness expected by those who oversaw the space. Another expectation involved repetition. Many tasks were performed daily, sometimes multiple times. The women repeated the same sequences until each movement became instinctual. Repetition created familiarity, reducing the need for correction or instruction. It also reinforced the sense that their work contributed to something enduring. The repetition helped the women understand that their role was less about unique moments and more about sustaining ongoing continuity. Finally, there was an expectation of completion. No task remained partially done. Whether sweeping a floor, arranging offerings, or preparing a chamber, the women followed each duty until the final adjustment was made. Completion ensured that the temple's order remained unbroken and that each part of the space reflected the care it required. These expectations shaped the daily work more than formal rules ever could. They guided the women through each movement, helping them maintain the calm and steady rhythm that defined life inside the temple. Through preparation, patience, precision, and endurance, the women became an integral part of the structure they served, preserving the sense of order that held the temple together. The rhythm of the day inside the temple unfolded through movements repeated so often that they became a quiet pattern, linking morning to evening. These movements guided the women through their responsibilities without the need for spoken instruction. Each action, from the smallest adjustment of an object to the steady crossing of a hall, held a place within the broader sequence of the day. The first movement began at the boundary of the living quarters, where the women stepped into the cool air of the temple corridors. They walked with calm, measured strides, neither hurried nor slow. This walk prepared them for the shift between private rest and collective duty. With each step, they settled into the steady pace that shaped the rest of the day. It was a transition marked not by sound but by posture, as shoulders lifted slightly and the gaze softened into focused attention. A common movement involved the preparation of spaces. Before any task could begin, cloths were smoothed over surfaces, lamps adjusted, and containers arranged. This preparation often required bending, stretching, and careful reaching. The women learned to move in ways that avoided unnecessary noise, placing objects with a controlled gentleness that preserved the calm of the rooms. These motions created the conditions for the rituals that followed, making each space ready without drawing attention to the effort involved. Another repeated movement came from tending to lamps. The women tilted the vessels, measured oil, and trimmed the wicks. Each action used a sequence that became instinctual over time. They held the small tools lightly, guided by a rhythm that felt steady and predictable. The warmth of the flame, the faint scent of oil, and the soft glow that followed became signals that the day continued without interruption. These motions added light to the rooms in a way that felt almost unnoticed, though the effect shaped the atmosphere around them. Sweeping formed another movement that shaped the day. Using long, even strokes, the women brushed dust into small piles that they later carried away. The sweeping followed clear lines along the floors, always avoiding the edges of more delicate objects. The sound of the broom against the stone created a soft, repetitive whisper that blended with the quiet movements around them. Sweeping was not simply a task, but a rhythm that echoed through the corridors, marking time in a gentle, unobtrusive way. Carrying vessels required another set of movements. The women lifted containers of water, baskets of offerings, or jars of grain with deliberate steadiness. Their arms adjusted automatically to the weight, and their bodies leaned slightly to counterbalance. These motions ensured that nothing spilled or shifted. Carrying became a form of silent communication, signaling readiness and progress without the need for words. Through these movements, tasks flowed smoothly from one stage to the next. There were also movements associated with the preparation of offerings. The women arranged items in ordered patterns, adjusting shapes, angles, and distances with small, precise motions. Their hands hovered momentarily before placing each object, judging the correct position through familiarity rather than direct instruction. These delicate adjustments repeated throughout the day, forming a cycle of careful placement and subtle correction. Another movement occurred when attending to fabrics within the temple. Cloths were lifted, folded, shaken, and laid out with deliberate control. The women executed these motions with practiced ease, ensuring that no crease disrupted the appearance of a surface. The lifting of cloth, the gentle release as it settled into place, and the smoothing that followed became a small ritual repeated across many rooms. A further movement involved opening and closing passages. The women pushed doors with quiet pressure, allowing the hinges to shift slowly so as not to disturb the stillness. They adjusted their pace when entering or leaving certain spaces, matching the level of silence required. This careful management of movement at thresholds helped maintain the separation between different areas of the temple, each with its own atmosphere and purpose. There were also gestures associated with maintaining tools. The women wiped surfaces, replaced worn items, and set tools back into designated positions. These actions occurred between larger tasks, forming a pattern of maintenance that kept the temple functioning smoothly. Each tool returned to its place reinforced the sense of order that shaped their daily work. In the final hours of the day, the women repeated many of the same movements they had performed in the morning, but with slower rhythms. Lamps were lowered in brightness, spaces adjusted for quiet, and materials stored for the next cycle. These motions signaled the transition toward rest, guiding their bodies back to the calm pace that preceded the beginning of the day. Through these movements, the women sustained the temple's rhythm without drawing attention to themselves. Each gesture, step, and adjustment contributed to a pattern that continued regardless of who performed it. The day unfolded through these motions, creating a steady continuity that shaped the work and the space alike. Silence inside the temple was not an absence but a framework that shaped how the women moved, behaved, and interacted. It was a rule woven into the structure of daily life, guiding everything from posture to breath. The silence formed an invisible boundary around each action, ensuring that the atmosphere of the temple remained steady and undisturbed. Rather than feeling empty, the silence carried weight and expectation, becoming a constant presence that followed the women through the hours. The first rule of silence concerned speech. Words were limited to what was necessary for completing tasks, and even then, they were spoken in low tones that faded quickly into the air. The women learned to communicate through glance, gesture, or shared familiarity. A tilt of the head could replace a question, while a shift in placement could mark the completion of a task. Over time, this quiet communication became second nature, reducing the need for verbal exchanges almost entirely. Movement was also governed by silence. Footsteps were adjusted to avoid echoing through long corridors. Sandals were placed carefully, and the pace slowed when approaching certain rooms. Even the act of turning or bending was done with attention to how cloth might sound against stone. These small adjustments preserved the calm environment and ensured that the temple retained its sense of stillness throughout the day. Another rule involved the handling of objects. Items were placed down softly, lifted with controlled steadiness, and arranged in ways that minimized disturbance. The women developed a touch that balanced precision with lightness. Whether adjusting a lamp, carrying a vessel, or placing offerings, their hands acted with a quiet discipline. The sound of an object striking a surface was rare, as silence required the removal of abrupt noise. Breathing followed its own rhythm within these rules. In certain rooms, the inhale and exhale slowed naturally, guided by the expectation of stillness. This calm breathing allowed the women to maintain focus and avoid the strain that accompanied long hours of work. The temple environment reinforced this pattern, encouraging a steady cycle that aligned with the slow pace of tasks. Silence extended to emotional expression. Reactions were kept controlled, avoiding sudden gestures or sharp movements that might disrupt the atmosphere. Even when tasks became demanding, the women learned to hold their expressions steady. This rule preserved not only the environment, but also a sense of internal composure that guided them through their duties. There was also a rule concerning shared spaces. When more than one woman worked in a room, each adjusted her movements to accommodate the presence of others without verbal coordination. They maintained enough distance to move freely, while remaining aware of the rhythm of nearby tasks. This silent cooperation allowed tasks to flow together, without conflict or interruption. Silence governed rest as well. During breaks, the women sat in measured postures, allowing their bodies to recover without shifting the mood of the temple. Even in private areas, the expectation of quiet lingered, shaping how they spoke and carried themselves. This continuity ensured that the transition back to duties felt natural and unbroken. Another rule concerned transitions between spaces. When entering or leaving a room, the women paused briefly to adjust to the level of quiet required. This small pause acted as a reminder of the atmosphere they maintained. It created a smooth shift between different tasks and rooms, reinforcing the structure of silence throughout the temple. Tools and materials followed their own rules within this system. They were stored in ways that prevented clatter, wrapped to soften any inadvertent noise, and handled with consistent care. Before using a tool, the women checked its placement and condition, ensuring that nothing disrupted the controlled environment. These habits became habitual, reflecting the depth of discipline expected in their duties. Silence also framed the end of each day. As tasks concluded, each sound softened further. Lamps were lowered, fabrics smoothed for the last time, and vessels arranged with deliberate caution. The quiet deepened into its most complete form as the women stepped away from their tasks and prepared for rest. Through these rules, silence became not just a requirement, but a defining element of temple life. It shaped behavior, guided interaction, and preserved the environment that surrounded the rituals within. The women carried this silence not as a burden, but as an integral part of their daily patterns, a constant presence that held the temple together. Boundaries inside the temple existed in forms both visible and unseen. They shaped how the women moved, where they walked, what they touched, and how they behaved. These boundaries were not marked by walls alone, but by quiet expectations that guided every part of their daily lives. Some boundaries were physical, defined by thresholds and pathways, while others lived in the rules of conduct they carried with them. Together, these limits formed the structure that held their work, their movements, and their presence in place. The first boundary appeared at the entrance to the inner rooms. The women stepped toward these areas with measured caution, aware that not every space permitted their presence. They learned to read the subtle signs carved near doorframes and the arrangement of objects near thresholds. These signs acted as reminders of where they were allowed to pass and where they were expected to pause. At some boundaries, they waited for silent approval from another attendant before crossing. At others, they stepped aside entirely, recognizing that the work inside required a different set of hands. Another boundary was defined by the objects they handled. Certain items, though placed in accessible areas, were not to be touched unless specifically required for a task. These objects rested on elevated surfaces or in deliberate patterns that signaled their importance. The women learned to move around them without disturbing their order. Even a slight shift of position could alter the flow of a ritual, so the boundary around such objects was one of invisible restraint. Their presence near these items required awareness and stillness rather than action. Pathways formed another clear type of boundary. Some corridors allowed free movement, while others demanded narrower, slower steps. The women recognized these boundaries through the lighting, the width of the passage, or the texture of the floor beneath their feet. In certain hallways, their pace naturally softened, guided less by rule than by the atmosphere imprinted on the space. These boundaries shaped not only where they walked, but how they walked, influencing the rhythm of each transition between rooms. There were also boundaries concerning the tools of daily work. Each tool had its designated place, and the women respected these placements without question. When a tool was needed, it was taken with care and returned exactly to its original position. This boundary preserved the order that allowed tasks to be completed without delay or confusion. A tool placed out of alignment disrupted more than appearance. It disturbed the system that held the workflow together. The boundary existed in the silent expectation that nothing should be misplaced, even by a finger's width. Emotional boundaries formed another layer of presence. The women carried themselves with restraint, limiting expressions that could alter the mood of a room. These boundaries prevented frustration, excitement, or uncertainty from influencing the calm environment. When a task required greater effort, the boundary encouraged them to focus inward rather than outward, maintaining steadiness regardless of the challenges they faced. This emotional containment ensured that their presence remained consistent, supporting the atmosphere of quiet continuity. There were boundaries related to timing as well. Each task belonged to a specific part of the day, and the women adhered strictly to this structure. Preparing offerings, tending lamps, arranging surfaces, and maintaining tools followed a sequence that rarely shifted. The boundary of time ensured that tasks never overlapped in a way that caused disorder. Even moments of waiting held purpose within this structure, allowing the day to unfold through predictable intervals. Another boundary existed around communication. The women used gestures rather than words to convey instructions or acknowledgments. This boundary minimized unnecessary noise and preserved the calm required in the temple. A slight nod could signal completion. A hand, lightly raised, could request assistance. These small gestures formed a language defined not by vocabulary, but by consistency. Respecting this boundary ensured that the shared environment remained undisturbed. Space itself created boundaries through distance. When more than one woman worked in a room, they adjusted their positions with care, creating enough separation to allow each task to proceed without intrusion. This boundary of personal space was subtle yet essential. It prevented accidental contact, maintained concentration, and supported a flow that allowed multiple duties to unfold at once. The women learned to sense the presence of others without looking directly, adjusting their paths with gentle shifts of movement. The final boundary appeared at the end of each day, when the women stepped away from the rooms they tended. Once tasks were completed, they crossed these boundaries in reverse, leaving behind the areas shaped by their work. The atmosphere deepened into quiet as lamps dimmed and surfaces settled. These boundaries marked the transition between duty and rest, signaling that the cycle had reached its conclusion. As they stepped past the last threshold, they carried the same calm presence with them, prepared to return when the next day began. Through these boundaries, the women existed within a structure that guided their presence without constant instruction. Each boundary shaped their actions, movements, and interactions, creating a framework that supported the continuity of temple life. These limits did not confine them, but aligned their work with the steady rhythm that defined the space they served. Stillness inside the temple was more than the absence of movement. It was a condition that shaped the environment, influenced the women's work, and surrounded the rituals with a sense of quiet permanence. This stillness formed the final layer of their daily experience, holding everything they did within a calm and steady atmosphere. It existed in the spaces between tasks, the air around each object, and the moments when time seemed to pause before the next duty began. The first expression of stillness appeared in the early hours, when the temple rested in shadow before any footsteps disturbed the floor. The women stepped into this quiet with an awareness that their presence was entering a space that had held stillness overnight. They did not rush to break it. Instead, their movements aligned with the environment, allowing the stillness to settle around them as they began the day. This initial calm set the tone for everything that followed. Stillness also lived in the rooms where offerings were prepared. Even when tasks filled the air with small motions, the overall atmosphere remained unbroken. The women placed items with careful hands, adjusted arrangements with slow precision, and allowed any shift in position to occur without abruptness. Each movement became part of a larger quiet that defined the nature of the space. The stillness did not resist their work. It absorbed it, maintaining a balance between activity and calm. There was stillness in the way objects were handled. Lamps, vessels, cloths, and tools moved through the women's hands with a softness that prevented sharp sounds or sudden changes. When an object settled into position, it did so with a faint, controlled touch that preserved the quiet around it. This practice created an environment where even the smallest action felt deliberate and measured. The responsibility of maintaining stillness extended to everything they touched. Stillness surrounded transitions between rooms as well. When moving through corridors, the women adjusted their pace to match the calm of the space. The long hallways carried a muted echo that softened even further when footsteps slowed. Each transition felt like stepping into a deeper layer of quiet, where the boundary between one area and the next was marked not by doors, but by a shift in the quality of stillness. These transitions guided their attention inward, preparing them for the next task. There was also stillness in waiting. Some tasks required pauses between steps, allowing lamps to settle, incense to disperse, or surfaces to absorb oils. During these pauses, the women stood with steady posture, neither tense nor relaxed, simply holding the moment without expectation. These intervals became part of the rhythm of their duties, teaching patience without requiring stillness to become stagnant. The pauses held their place within the structure of the day. Stillness defined the air during more delicate duties. When tending to fabrics, adjusting arrangements, or preparing surfaces, the women allowed the calm to influence the timing of their gestures. They moved with an even flow that kept the atmosphere undisturbed. A change in breathing or the tightening of a hand could disrupt this balance, so each action aligned with the stillness around them. The consistency of this atmosphere created an environment where concentration deepened without strain. Another form of stillness emerged in moments of shared work. When several women were present in one room, their coordinated motions created a silence that felt collective. Each person sensed the rhythm of the others, adjusting movements to avoid overlapping or causing interruption. This shared stillness strengthened the sense of unity among them, turning separate tasks into a single quiet pattern. The environment responded in kind, maintaining a calm that supported every action. Stillness also appeared at the boundaries of the temple. When standing near thresholds they rarely crossed, the women felt the quiet settle into a deeper form. These areas held an atmosphere that required heightened restraint, encouraging them to move with even greater care. The stillness here served as a reminder of the temple's structure, its layers, and the roles assigned within it. The women respected this quality of calm, recognizing its significance in maintaining the order of the space. At the end of the day, stillness returned in its fullest form. As tasks concluded and lamps dimmed, the quiet expanded through the corridors. Objects rested untouched, surfaces smoothed into final arrangement, and the air held a steady calm that signaled closure. The women stepped back from their duties with the same measured awareness they brought in the morning. The stillness they preserved throughout the day settled once more into the environment, ready to remain until they returned. Through this stillness, the temple maintained its sense of continuity. The women upheld it through their movements, their choices, and their attention to the quiet within each task. It shaped their world in ways that required no explanation, holding together every detail of the life they lived inside the temple. The life lived inside the temple carried a quiet weight that shaped the women's days from beginning to end. This weight did not come from burden or hardship alone, but from the steady expectation that their presence maintained the order of a world that extended far beyond their own. Every movement, every silence, every boundary they respected became part of a larger pattern of devotion. This final layer of their existence held the meaning that tied their tasks together, forming a life defined by continuity rather than change. The first part of this weight appeared in the constancy of their duties. Each day followed patterns they could trace without thought, yet the repetition did not lessen their significance. The women understood that their actions contributed to the structure of the temple, supporting rituals that others depended on. This constancy gave shape to their roles, grounding them in a rhythm that linked each day to the next. Through this repetition, their devotion became a quiet thread woven into the life of the temple. There was also weight in the care they provided to the spaces around them. They moved through rooms that demanded attention to detail, maintaining surfaces, objects, and arrangements that required precision. This care reflected an understanding that the smallest change could alter the harmony of the environment. The women carried this responsibility with steady acceptance, allowing their devotion to guide their hands without hesitation. The weight was not oppressive, but ever-present, reminding them of the significance of even the smallest task. The women felt the weight of devotion in the restraint they practiced. Silence, stillness, controlled movement, and consistent behavior shaped their days, reminding them that their personal expression remained secondary to the order of the temple. This restraint became natural over time, forming an inner discipline that matched the outer calm they maintained. The quiet weight of this discipline guided them through each moment, ensuring that their presence aligned with the expectations of the space they served. This weight extended to the unseen aspects of their work. Much of what they accomplished remained unnoticed by others, yet the women understood that the value of their devotion was not measured through recognition. Their tasks supported rituals they did not perform, and prepared rooms for events they did not witness. Devotion meant embracing roles that existed in the background, providing foundations for practices that defined the temple's purpose. The weight of this unseen service shaped how they understood themselves and the work they performed. Another part of this weight arose in the unbroken flow of time. The women experienced days that rarely shifted in structure, creating a sense of timelessness within the temple walls. Seasons changed outside, but inside, the rhythm remained steady. This continuity formed a quiet anchor, allowing their devotion to exist without interruption. The weight of this time did not press down on them. Rather, it held them in place, offering stability that defined their daily existence. The women felt the weight of devotion when sharing space with one another. Their tasks intertwined without conflict, shaped by silent cooperation and mutual awareness. This shared presence created an unspoken bond, formed not through conversation, but through synchronized movement and steady attention to shared duties. The weight they carried did not separate them but connected them, reminding each woman that she worked as part of a larger whole. There was weight in the expectations placed upon them. They knew where they could walk, what they could touch, how they should behave, and when they should complete each task. These expectations framed their lives, shaping not only their actions, but also their understanding of place and purpose. The women carried this weight with acceptance, allowing it to guide their days without resistance. It formed a quiet structure that remained constant through every hour. The final expression of this weight appeared in the quiet at the end of the day. As the women stepped away from their tasks, they left behind rooms arranged with care, lamps tended with precision, and objects placed with purpose. The stillness that filled the temple reflected the devotion they carried through the day. In the fading light, the weight did not lift. It settled gently into the spaces they had shaped, ready to rise again when the next morning began. Through this quiet weight, the women's lives formed a continuous line of devotion. Their actions held meaning because they were steady, restrained, and aligned with the rhythm of the temple. The life they lived did not change with dramatic events or sudden turns. Instead, it unfolded through the calm repetition of tasks that built a world defined by order and stillness. The quiet weight of their devotion remained with them always, shaping their presence and holding together the world they served. The patterns inside the temple did not depend on any single woman. They existed before each one arrived, and continued long after she stepped away from her duties. This continuity formed the final layer of life within the temple, a recognition that the work, the silence, the stillness, and the boundaries belonged to a rhythm larger than any individual. The women moved within these patterns, shaping them through daily practice while also being shaped by them in return. The endurance of these patterns held the temple together across generations. The first sign of this continuity appeared in the morning rituals that began before the women fully woke. The expected sequence remained unchanged, guiding their steps in ways so familiar that each new day felt connected to the previous one. The women did not question these patterns. They accepted them as part of the environment they entered. Even the smallest motion aligned with habits passed down through long lines of attendants who had walked the same corridors, tended the same surfaces, and followed the same rhythms of quiet work. These patterns extended to the arrangement of spaces. Rooms were ordered in ways that encouraged certain movements and discouraged others. The placement of objects created a flow that shaped how tasks unfolded, influencing the women's behavior without the need for instruction. The temple seemed to hold its own memory, guiding each action through the structures of previous days. As the women moved through these spaces, they became part of the pattern themselves, repeating gestures that countless others had made before them. The tools they used reflected this continuity as well. Each tool carried marks of previous hands, shaped by years of careful handling. The women adopted these tools with ease, recognizing their roles within tasks that had followed the same sequence through time. The patterns were not preserved through words or written rules, but through the repetition of use, the preservation of placement, and the practiced motions that passed from one generation of attendants to another. The silence of the temple survived through these patterns. It was not created anew each day, but maintained through adherence to long-established expectations. The women respected this silence because it had been upheld by those before them. Each quiet gesture reinforced a tradition that extended beyond personal duty. By aligning with this silence, the women stepped into a legacy that carried the calm stillness of the temple across years that left no visible trace, but shaped every moment within its walls. Stillness formed another part of these enduring patterns. It settled into the architecture, the arrangement of objects, and the steady habits of those who served. The women did not invent this stillness. They inherited it from the environment itself. Their movements preserved it not because they were told to do so, but because it was the natural state of the space. Stillness passed from one day to the next, through the consistent attention given to maintaining it. Even the boundaries that guided the women's presence reflected a heritage older than any individual. These boundaries had been shaped by countless attendants who learned the layout, respected the limits, and adjusted their behavior according to the structure of the temple. When a woman reached a threshold she did not cross, she stepped into a tradition held in place by the many who had stood before her. The boundaries remained steady, unchanged by time, strengthened by every passing generation. The patterns also existed in the cooperation among the women. Their shared movements, aligned through silence and mutual awareness, echoed the behavior of earlier groups who had worked in the same rooms. Cooperation became a natural extension of these patterns, emerging not from instruction but from instinct shaped by daily repetition. Through this rhythm, Their presence merged into the ongoing flow of temple life, contributing without disrupting. At the end of each day, the patterns continued without pause. As lamps dimmed and the room settled into stillness, the work completed that day blended seamlessly with the work that had come before. The women stepped away knowing that the same tasks would return the next morning, with familiar shape and quiet expectation. Their devotion contributed to the continuity of the temple, yet the patterns no longer depended on any one person. They remained unchanged, waiting to be taken up again. Through these enduring patterns, the temple preserved its atmosphere and purpose across time. The women lived within these structures, carrying out roles that aligned with a rhythm older than they were and destined to outlast them. The continuity created a sense of belonging without ownership, reminding them that their lives added to something larger and more lasting. The patterns that continued after them held the temple together, allowing its quiet world to remain steady, ordered, and complete.